Hey, I have a question for you. What do the names SACCO and VANZETTI signify to you? Please leave me a comment if you've got an answer to that question. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them as I go ahead and do this Blu-ray review of a recent release by Kino Lorber of a film by that name, SACCO and VANZETTI. This is from 1971. The director is Giuliano Montaldo. He didn't have a real big breakout career as far as Western audiences were concerned, as far as English-speaking audiences, but he was known for making politically oriented films, especially those that kind of focused on various expressions of injustice, whether that's through the court system, like this film, through the religious persecution of a man like Giordano Bruno, which was kind of his follow-up to this film in '73, and other films that talked about corruption within the military or within government. He seemed to be a filmmaker of some conscience who had sort of a message that he wanted to impress upon his viewers. So SACCO and VANZETTI, basically this is a portrayal of a very sensational crime trial, and then basically the issue grew quite big well after the men were convicted for crimes that they claimed to be innocent of, that involved robbery and murder. There was a factory that's payroll was stolen in the process. There were a group of men who drove up to the factory in a vehicle, started shooting. A couple of bystanders were killed, and and the police were on the lookout. They picked up these two men, Nicola Sacco, who was a married family man, a shoe repairman, a cobbler, you could say, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who was a fishmonger. But these two men who had come over from Italy as teenagers in the 19-teens, were arrested and subsequently brought to trial and found guilty of these crimes in a court proceedings that has not stood up very well to the test of time. As far as the transcripts are concerned, there's been a lot of people who have looked at it and says this trial was not conducted on the up and up. Doesn't mean that the men had nothing to do with the radical political groups that the government was going after in these trials, but they did not get a fair hearing, and they were ultimately put on death row and put to death in the electric chair. But between the time of their trial and the time they actually were executed, their cause became kind of a big global phenomenon. That was partly because of the eloquence of Bartolomeo Vanzetti in particular, who was a man of principle and a man who was truly just fighting for a more just world where he or his descendants at least might be able to enjoy freedom and opportunity and the rights of the pursuit of happiness and all of those promises that are supposed to be part of the American dream. He found his experience very different than that when he came over from Italy, did get involved in some pretty radical and anarchist political movements, and that sort of brought him under the government's scrutiny. The film is pretty powerful. It's kind of a procedural, and it could be seen as a little bit straightforward and dry, but it's a very compelling portrayal of a pretty ugly episode in American history, as well as an opportunity to kind of get in touch with the machinations of our political and judicial system. The lead actor, Jean-Marie Volonté, who plays Vanzetti in particular, I thought was quite good. I've been a fan of his. He was in Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion. He was also pretty well known in some of his contributions to spaghetti western films. This is a quality release. If you're interested in the material, or if you're interested in that kind of Italian political style cinema, this is a real nice slice of that. You could also talk about Francesco Rosi and other directors of that time who really tried to infuse their films with kind of a consciousness-raising effect. This even has kind of a collaboration between Ennio Morricone and Joan Baez, the American folk singer. They collaborated and she sings a few songs. I'll tell you, for my taste, a little bit of Joan Baez goes a long way, but it's kind of cool to see her contributing to this effort in the early 1970s. The Blu-ray also features a commentary track by British filmmaker Alex Cox, which is interesting. When he talks, he has some interesting stuff to say, but he does kind of just sit quietly quite a bit of the time. And so I felt he could have maybe prepped a little bit more. It felt like he really just sat down, watched the movie, and spoke whatever came to his mind. I mean, he does have some good information. He does provide some historic context and does, add value to the disc. But at the same time, I think he could have been a little bit more energized and dynamic. So I do recommend this if you're interested in the history of 1920s, or just really the history of American jurisprudence and the corruption and the hypocrisy and the very clear tilting of bias in favor of the powerful and the privileged, often at the expense of those who are exploited, marginalized, and not really considered worthy of all the freedoms and liberties and considerations that citizens ought to be. So yeah, that's my review. Those are my comments, and I definitely say check it out. What I've said draws some intrigue on your end.